Working in a morgue was far from what I had dreamed of as a child. But circumstances led me here after graduating from medical college. I couldn't find a better offer and decided to take this temporary job. At first glance, it seemed like a calm and routine job. But one night changed everything. The morgue was located on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by dense forest. The building was old and dilapidated, and the corridors were always damp and cold. My shifts took place at night when the silence became particularly oppressive. Colleagues joked that the place was haunted, but I didn't believe such stories. Until that night. I was working alone, as usual. It was around 2 in the morning when I finished with the last body and sat down at my desk to rest a bit. The place was dead silent, interrupted only by my breathing and the muffled hum of the lamps. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me tense up. It was a quiet, barely perceptible whisper coming from the depths of the corridor. I chalked it up to my imagination and fatigue, but the whisper grew louder and clearer. It was coming from the morgue where the bodies were stored. My heart began to beat faster, but I forced myself to go check. The door to the morgue was ajar, with a faint light seeping through. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty, as expected. I looked around and noticed that one of the bodies on the table was not fully covered. I approached to adjust the sheet, and then I saw that the corpse's eyes were open and staring straight at me. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears. But then I remembered that sometimes muscles can contract after death, causing such phenomena. I took a deep breath, calming myself. But as soon as I turned to leave, there was a loud thud from the refrigeration unit. The thud repeated, even louder. I felt chills run down my spine. I walked over to the unit and opened it. Inside lay the body of a woman who had been brought in a few hours earlier. But her eyes were open and she was staring straight at me. And then she spoke. "Help me." Her voice was hoarse and barely audible, but I clearly heard those words. I froze, unable to believe my ears. The woman continued to whisper, and her lips were moving. "Help me. Find my son." I didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed me, but I tried to stay calm. This couldn't be real. Corpses don't talk. I closed the refrigerator door again and tried to leave, but I felt someone grab my hand. It was the same woman. Her cold fingers gripped my hand tightly, and her eyes bore into mine. I tried to pull away, but her grip was too strong. "Find my son," she whispered before her eyes closed, and she became still again. I broke free of her grip and ran for the exit. I couldn't believe what had just happened, but I knew one thing: I had to find her son, or this nightmare wouldn't end. The next day, I began my investigation. I learned that the woman's name was Maria, and that she did indeed have a son named Alexei, but he had gone missing several years ago. I decided to find him, despite all the risks. My search led me to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. I felt that I would find answers to my questions there. The house was in terrible condition, but I went inside. It was pitch dark inside, so I turned on my flashlight. In one of the rooms, I found Maria's diary. She wrote about her son and how he was obsessed with the idea of summoning some dark forces. The diary described rituals and spells he had tried to perform. I realized that Alexei might have summoned something that was now haunting his mother. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Alexei's ghost. His eyes burned with anger, and he slowly approached me. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "Now you'll be part of this curse too." I ran to the exit, but the door slammed shut in front of me. Alexei was already close, and I felt his cold breath on my neck. I closed my eyes and recited a spell I had found in Maria's diary. Suddenly, everything around me went silent. When I opened my eyes, Alexei's ghost was gone. I ran out of the house and never returned. But the nightmares continued to haunt me. I couldn't forget those cold eyes and the whisper echoing in my ears. I quit my job at the morgue and moved to another city. But even now, years later, I feel someone's gaze on me, and the sinister whisper lingers in my ears. I know one thing: I won't find peace until I uncover the mystery of what happened that night.
Every year, at the beginning of autumn, my best friend John and I would go on a traditional hike in the woods. We loved these outings: the silence, solitude, and fresh air helped us escape the city hustle and daily worries. This year, we decided to venture into a more remote area where no tourist had set foot. The forest was dense and ancient, with centuries-old trees bowing their moss-covered branches over narrow trails. This place always drew us with its mystery and desolation.
We arrived at the forest early in the morning, just as the first rays of the sun began to filter through the thick foliage. Our backpacks were filled with everything necessary: tents, provisions, flashlights, and even an old compass that had belonged to my grandfather. The day passed peacefully, as we enjoyed nature, cooked over the fire, and discussed the latest news. But by evening, as the sky began to darken, a strange tension hung in the air. We chose a campsite in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. After setting up the tent and lighting a fire, we sat down to dinner. John suddenly noted, "Have you noticed how quiet it is here?" His voice sounded unnatural. "It's like no living thing inhabits this forest." I nodded, glancing at the shadows cast by our fire. "Yeah, it is strange. Usually the forest is full of sounds: birds, insects, rustling leaves. But here, nothing." We continued our dinner, trying not to pay attention to our feelings. However, soon the silence became almost deafening. Night fell upon the forest, and our fire became the only source of light in the darkness. We sat by the fire, trying to relax, when suddenly we heard a faint sound as if someone was quietly stepping on the leaves. "Did you hear that?" John whispered, peering into the darkness. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. We both stood, holding our flashlights. The beams of light flickered across the trees, but we saw nothing suspicious. Deciding it might just be the wind, we sat back down by the fire. But the sound repeated, this time closer and more distinct. Our flashlights lit up the darkness again, and at that moment I noticed something strange. A shadow flickered between the trees, too large for a regular animal. It moved smoothly, almost silently, and vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Did you see that?" John whispered, grabbing my arm. "Yeah, I saw it," I replied, trying not to panic. It didn't look like an animal. We decided it was best to stay by the fire. Its light and warmth seemed like our only protection. Time dragged on slowly, and every rustle made us jump, but the real horrors began later. When the clock struck midnight, we heard something that made our hearts stop. It was a quiet but clear whisper coming from the direction of the forest. The words were indistinguishable, but the mere fact of their existence was terrifying. We both realized that there was something or someone in the forest watching us. "We need to get out of here," John said, his voice shaking with fear. "Immediately." But leaving wasn't so simple. The forest at night had become foreign and hostile. We knew that leaving the fire could be deadly. We had no choice but to wait for dawn. But the whispering grew louder, the words gradually forming sentences. "They have come." "They shouldn't have come," the voices whispered. "Leave, while you still can." We sat by the fire, clutching our flashlights and knives. It felt like time had stopped. The night dragged on endlessly. Suddenly, the shadows began to thicken around us. Out of the darkness, figures started to emerge, ghostly, almost transparent, with distorted faces and hollow eyes. They surrounded us, making no move forward. John, pale as a sheet, whispered, "This can't be real." But it was real. The ghosts didn't advance, but their presence was unbearable. We heard a new whisper, louder than the others. "You shouldn't have come here. This place is cursed." I remembered old tales about an ancient curse that hung over this forest. It was said that a gruesome murder had taken place here once, and the souls of the murdered could not find peace. They roamed the forest, guarding their territory from intruders. "We need to apologize," John suddenly said, his voice filled with determination. "Maybe they will let us go." We stood up and, trembling with fear, began to speak, apologizing for our intrusion. The ghosts continued to stare at us, but the whispering gradually faded. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward and said, "Leave, and never return." It was dawn. The shadows began to dissipate, and the ghosts vanished as abruptly as they had appeared. We wasted no time, quickly packing our things and heading out of the forest. The morning light felt like salvation, but the terror of the past night stayed with us. We left the forest, trying not to look back. John and I made a vow never to return there. This hike remained forever in our memories as the most frightening and mysterious experience of our lives. Many years have passed since then, but I still remember those nocturnal whispers and ghostly figures. Sometimes, waking up at night, I feel someone watching me and hear those same words leave and never return.
Every summer, a circus came to our small town, and it was an event that no one wanted to miss. The hum of the crowd, the light of the floodlights, the aroma of popcorn and cotton candy, all this created an atmosphere of magic and fun. But this summer, the circus brought something new and unexpected, something that turned our entertainment into a nightmare. I went to the performance with my best friend, Mike. We love circus shows, especially clowns with their colorful costumes and silly antics. But this time there was one clown who stood out from the rest. His name was Smiley. Unlike the others, his face was painted in alarming, almost painful shades, and his smile was unnaturally wide and sinister. Smiley appeared in the arena during the main show. His movements were abrupt and unnatural, and his laughter sounded as if it came from the depths of hell. Mike and I exchanged glances, feeling cold sweat break out on our foreheads. It was not what we expected to see. After the show, we wandered around the fairground discussing the performance, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave us. Smiley was too realistic, too scary. We decided to go to the back of the circus tent, where the trailers of the artists were. Mike insisted on learning more about Smiley. We cautiously approached the trailer with the word Smiley on the door. The window was ajar, and we looked inside. What we saw made our hearts freeze. Smiley himself was inside, but his face without makeup was even more frightening. There was a twisted grin on his face, and his eyes glittered with a mad fire. He was talking to someone, but we didn't see who. His voice was low and hoarse, and we could barely make out the words. "They're still here," Smiley whispered. "Their souls feed me. They think it's just a show, but they're wrong." Mike and I recoiled from the window in disbelief. We decided to return to our camp and discuss what to do next. But as soon as we turned around, Smiley himself was standing in front of us. His face was illuminated by the dim light of the street lamp, and his smile grew even wider. "Are you looking for something, boys? What is it?" he asked, his voice laced with malice. We froze in place, unable to move. Smiley took a step forward, and we felt an icy chill emanate from him. "You shouldn't spy on something you don't understand," he continued, his eyes boring into us. We turned around and ran, not taking apart the road. Our hearts were pounding and our legs were shaking with fear. We could hear Smiley's ominous laughter coming from behind us, and it drove us even harder. We ran to our camp and locked ourselves in a tent, trying to calm down. The night passed in nightmares. I saw Smiley's face, his evil grin and burning eyes. In the morning, we decided to leave the city and tell the adults about everything. But something strange happened. As soon as we approached the exit from the camp, we were stopped by a policeman. "Where are you going?" "What is it?" he asked, his gaze cold and suspicious. We told him everything we had seen and heard, but he just shook his head. "You must be mistaken. There is no Smiley in this circus. It never happened," he said. We couldn't believe our ears. We went back to the circus and tried to find evidence. But Smiley's trailer is gone, as is the clown himself. All the artists claimed that they had never heard of such a clown. A few days passed, but Mike and I couldn't forget that horror. One evening, I decided to go to the library and look for information about the circus. I came across an old newspaper clipping dated several decades ago. The article talked about the strange disappearances associated with a circus that toured the country. People disappeared without a trace, and among the suspects was a clown named Smiley. My hands trembled when I read the article to the end. It turned out that this clown had been caught and burned alive for his crimes. But before he died, he cursed everyone who dared to reveal his secret. I realized that Mike and I had become part of this terrible story. We've solved a mystery we shouldn't have known. And now Smiley won't leave us alone. Since then, we have lived in constant fear. We saw his face in our nightmares, heard his sinister laughter in the dark. He was watching us, lurking in the shadows. And I know one thing: as long as we're alive, he won't calm down. Many years have passed, but the nightmare does not end. I can still feel his presence. Sometimes, waking up at night, I see his shadow in the corner of the room and hear him whisper, "You are mine, forever." The story of Smiley has become a local legend. But I know that this is not just a fiction. This is a reality from which it is impossible to hide. And every time I hear circus music, I get a panic attack. Because I know that Smiley is always there, waiting in the wings to take us into his gloomy embrace.